Well, hey there. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to our series we're calling New Lease on Life. If you've been with us, welcome back. This is our Easter series. Some of you think Easter is just a day, but in the Christian church, Easter is actually a whole season. So we're doing a series covering this whole Easter season that we're calling New Lease on Life. When you hear that phrase, I hope that you think of someone, maybe even yourself, when you were at your lowest point, maybe in your darkest moment, struggling, wondering if you could even keep going, and then something happened, and you or someone you know is kind of miraculously restored. They found new purpose, a new sense of meaning, this kind of reinvigorated spirit, like they could try again. That's the sort of thing that you see happening to Jesus' disciples in the days and weeks following his death and resurrection. For them, Jesus' crucifixion was their lowest point. It was their darkest moment. I mean, these were people who were largely poor, uneducated. They didn't have what the established leaders considered what it takes. They were living under the brutal thumb of the Roman Empire. So when Jesus first called them, when he began to teach them about the kingdom of God, when they watched him perform miracles, when they listened to him teach, it filled them with a sense of life, like life could be different, that their lives could be different. But then he was crucified. And in that moment, all of their hopes were dashed. This was their lowest point, their darkest moment. But then Jesus rises from the dead. And in the days and weeks following his resurrection, he begins to appear to them. And as you follow their story out, it gives them this new lease on life. They are changed people forever. That's what we're talking about in this series. Another way to think about this, an illustration that we're using is a sort of plant metaphor. As far as plant people are concerned, growing plants is a super easy thing, right? They'll tell you it's just water and sun, but that's not true. There are lots of reasons why plants don't do well. One of the reasons plants don't do well is because sometimes they're growing in too small a container where the soil is too shallow, right? And you can water and that plant, you can put it out in the sun and it isn't going to matter. The solution in a case like that is you actually have to uproot it. And you have to break up the root ball that ends up getting all kind of ingrown, and you've got to replant it in a bigger space. And that is one way to think about what Jesus is doing in all of these resurrection appearances. He's coming to people who are living in a small, cramped space. Another way to think about that is they're living in a small, cramped story. He died, and in the time between his death and resurrection, they're telling themselves a story. And their stories are characterized by things like fear and loss and confusion and doubt and shame. But when Jesus appears to them after his resurrection, it's like he's pulling them up, he's uprooting them, he's breaking that story up, and then he's replanting them in a bigger story. So what we're doing in this series is we're looking at some of these individual encounters. We're trying to talk about what's the story they're living in, because their story could be your story. It could be our story. And what Jesus does for them may be something that Jesus wants to do for us. So each week we're looking at one of these resurrection appearances. Last week we looked at the story where Jesus appears to a woman named Mary Magdalene. Today we're going to look at an encounter that comes to us from Luke's telling of the Jesus story, when Jesus appears to two of his disciples who are walking on a road between Jerusalem, where Jesus was executed, and a town called Emmaus. So this story is in Luke chapter 24. It starts in verse 13. This is how it goes. That same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said." Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he were going on, but they begged him, "Stay the night with us, since it's getting late." So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. You know, I can't help when I read this story or I hear this story to ask myself, why are two of Jesus' disciples leaving Jerusalem and going to Emmaus? I mean, they obviously lived there, so that's one reason. But what I'm asking is, why do it right now? Right? Jesus had just been crucified, and on the morning when a bunch of women show up and tell you that his body is missing and that angels appeared to them and told them that Jesus was alive, why do you choose in that moment to leave Jerusalem to go home? I mean, isn't Jerusalem the place that you would want to be after watching your master, your teacher, your leader, the person you thought was your Messiah, after watching him get crucified, and now there's a possibility that he's alive and you leave to go home? What's that all about? You know, maybe the answer to that question is found in the answer to why Jesus chooses to appear to them. I mean, they had just been with Jesus' other disciples who, as far as the kind of organized Jesus movement is concerned, were more important than they were. I mean, people like Peter and John or whatever. So like Jesus easily could have just appeared in that room to all of them, right? Why is Jesus taking the time to appear to these two disciples while they're walking on the road between Jerusalem and Emmaus? Well, I wonder if they're not just walking. What if Jesus chooses to appear to them because they're not just walking, and they're not just walking home, they're walking away? What if the reason Jesus is showing up and appearing to them is because, based on the events of the weekend, they're not sure what to believe anymore? Or if to believe at all. Not knowing what to believe is a hop, skip, and a jump away from not believing at all. Maybe Jesus chooses to appear to these two travelers because they don't know what to believe anymore, and maybe they're on the verge of just giving it all up. You know, that is sadly a common experience for people of faith, especially in contemporary Western culture. You probably know this, but since 1972, when social surveys started collecting this data, every traditional Christian religious community has experienced decline. Some of them have experienced significant decline. And most of the people who have left traditional Christian religious spaces now consider themselves spiritual but not religious. So they're sometimes referred to as the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, as in none, no religion. They don't consider themselves religious anymore or identify with a specifically Christian religion. In fact, that group, the nuns, the people who think of themselves as spiritual but not religious, people who used to consider themselves Christian, that's actually the largest religious demographic in America today. It's up from about 5% of the general public in 1972 and just 17% of the public in 2012, 10 years ago. It's now over 26% of the general public, which is bigger than mainline Protestantism, bigger than evangelical Protestantism, bigger than Roman Catholicism. And there are several studies out that suggest the number one reason that people often cite for leaving their traditional Christian religion is that they no longer believe, or they no longer maintain the beliefs that they used to hold. And I wonder if that's what's going on with these two travelers. I wonder if they've gotten to a place where, because of things that they've seen and witnessed and the events of the weekend, they just don't know if they can maintain belief anymore. So they're walking away. They're on the verge of giving it up. You know, in my experience, there are a few reasons that lead to this kind of existential struggle or belief struggle, religious confusion. And it's interesting, I see all three of them operating in the lives of these two followers. The first, in my experience, is emotional. A lot of people, sadly, experience some kind of trauma in religious communities. Sexual scandals, abuse, leaders who turn out not to be who you thought they were or who they held themselves out to be. One author says that people are leaving certain versions of Christianity as an act of conscientious objection, right? That either they or someone they love was harmed in some way or hurt in some way, and they're out. I mean, trauma of any kind can leave a person confused and wondering what to believe, suffering some kind of existential struggle. But that is certainly the case if it's religious trauma, because religious environments are supposed to be places of healing, not harm. So when you suffer trauma in a religious context, it's almost inevitable that you're going to experience some kind of existential struggle. I bring that up because one of these travelers is identified by name, the name Cleopas. That's a male's name. A man named Cleopas. And if you know the stories in the Bible, the Jesus stories, what we call the Gospels, one of the Gospels is written by a man named John. And in John's telling of the Jesus story, one of the women who was at the foot of the cross, probably consoling Jesus' mother while Jesus was suffering and dying, one of the women is named Mary, the wife of Clopas. Clopas is one letter removed from Cleopas. It's possible, it is probable, that the Cleopas in Luke's story is the husband of Mary who John has at the foot of the cross. So the two people walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus are likely a married couple. It's Mary and her husband, Clopas. And if that's true, and it's likely true, then I want you to think about what Mary has experienced in the last couple of days. She didn't just hear about Jesus' death on the cross, she watched it. She was there at the foot of his cross. She saw the blood. She saw the anguish. She heard him speak. She was likely consoling his mother. That's traumatic. It's one thing to hear about Jesus suffering and dying. It's another thing to be an eyewitness to it. It's distinctly possible that Mary and her husband just don't know what to do anymore, having suffered so deeply this trauma of watching someone they loved be so brutally tortured and murdered. That's true for a lot of people who experience trauma like that. Another reason people often experience religious confusion or existential struggle is theological. People in churches are often handed a condensed, distilled form of belief. And that's appropriate. It makes sense, right? 4-year-olds are not capable of great nuance and complexity, so you have to give them a rather simplified belief system. But as people get older, if they are not able to, or if they're not given permission to question the simplicity of the system that they were handed, eventually it's going to crash against the hard rocks of reality. And when that happens, one very common response is for people to conclude, this isn't worth it. It's not real. I don't know what to believe anymore. And they give it up. This happens all the time to people in Christian communities. These two travelers are walking from Jerusalem to a town 7 miles away called Emmaus, and that may not be incidental to the story. 200 years before this, a man named Judah Maccabees led a revolt against the Roman Empire that ended up purchasing the people of Israel about 100 years of independence. Jews today still celebrate this event at Hanukkah. Well, the Maccabean revolt started in the town of Emmaus. There were many Jews during Jesus' day who hoped that God would send them a Messiah like Judah Maccabees, who would overcome the Romans. And that longing was probably hyper intense among the people who lived in the town where the Maccabean revolt happened 200 years earlier. So it's not incidental to the story that these two travelers live in Emmaus, and one of the things that they say to Jesus is, we had hoped that he would be our Messiah, that he would rescue the people of Israel. That's code for, we hoped he'd be another Judah Maccabees who would take down the Romans. That's what they believed. That's what they hoped for. That's how they thought it was going to work. Of course, then that belief system crashes up against the hard rocks of reality, which is the cross. They thought Jesus was going to be a Messiah like Judah Maccabees, but then the Romans killed him, so they were obviously wrong. They thought it was going to work this way, or they thought it worked this way. It obviously doesn't, but they don't know now how it works. The story they had has been kind of deconstructed and destroyed. They don't have any idea how to put those pieces back together in a different, meaningful whole. And that happens to a lot of people of faith. The system that they were given, eventually it crashes up against the hard rocks of reality. It falls to pieces. They don't know how to put it back together in any meaningful way, and they just give it up. So sometimes our religious confusion, our existential struggle, it's driven emotionally by trauma. Sometimes it's driven theologically. But there's a third reason that I identify in this story that I think is important to talk about. Sometimes when we experience confusion or existential struggle, when we don't know what to believe anymore and we're on the verge of walking away, we often interpret that as a bad thing. Sometimes it's not. You know, in all of the great writing on spiritual formation in the Christian tradition, everyone talks about the need to go through a season or seasons of confusion, doubt, kind of existential fog, not exactly sure what to believe or how it works. That's actually an important part of the spiritual journey, one that God may actually be orchestrating in your life. So in addition to the emotional trauma that these two travelers may have been experiencing, and in addition to the obvious theological misconceptions that they had, it also says that God prevented them from recognizing Jesus. That these travelers weren't just dull, that God actually closes their eyes in some way, makes it somehow impossible for them to recognize the person they loved so much that they had given their lives to. Now that may sound harsh to you and me, but it may have been an important part of their journey, part of their process. I mean, think about it. If they are dealing with emotional struggle and trauma from what they've witnessed over the last few days, Jesus doesn't just step into that and offer a quick fix. He walks with them. He asks them what they're talking about. He gives them an opportunity to process, to articulate out loud what they've witnessed and what they're thinking and how it makes them feel and what their hopes were and now what they're worried about, and all of these things. People who have experienced pain, especially if it's come in or through a religious context, sometimes before they're ready for some kind of consolation, they need to just be able to process that, to talk about it, to articulate it, for someone to just hear it and receive it with no fix. That sort of sets the stage for the next step in their journey. I wonder if they had just been able to recognize Jesus right away, if that would have short-circuited that somehow. The fact that they don't know it's him gives them a chance to just talk about where they are. Not where they should be or where they were, but where they are in this moment. I think that's an important part of their process. Having done that, though, Jesus is then able to put his finger on kind of the crux of their confusion. Right? They thought that Jesus was going to be one kind of Messiah. He obviously wasn't because he was killed. And now they don't know how to understand their story anymore. And Jesus steps into that, and it says that he walks them through the scriptures, explaining to them everything concerning himself. He reinterprets the Bible for them so that they can see the whole story in a new way. The story that they had was shattered, and they need a new one. And Jesus gives that to them. So he gives them space to identify and process where they are, but then he gives them something new, something different to believe in or to think about. And it's only kind of after those two things have happened, where they've been able to process where they are, they've been able to imagine or reconsider how the story might work, a story they thought they already knew. And when those things happen, it's then that they're able to recognize him, which happens when he breaks bread in their home, something that they probably did with him on any number of occasions. You see how there's sort of a mechanics to this. They process where they are, they reimagine the story in a way that starts to make some sense to them, and then they connect. They connect with the Jesus they had always known, but it's in a new way. Right? For whatever the reason, whether it's emotional pain that's induced by religious trauma, it's theological confusion, or it's God orchestrating a season in people's lives, blinding them, if you will, for a time. A lot of people in contemporary Western culture They don't know what to believe anymore. And they're not just walking, they're walking away. They're leaving behind the faith that they used to have. And that may be you. I recognize a message like this may not be for everybody right now, but somebody watching this is in this place where you're on the verge of walking away. When you're dealing with this kind of existential pain or religious confusion, the solution may be to go for a walk. But the solution's not to walk away. The solution is to have a new encounter with the risen Jesus. It's to take all the pain and the struggle and the confusion that you're feeling and experiencing and offload it onto the risen Jesus. It's to take some time to reimagine the story, to reimagine your story, maybe to reimagine who you are or who other people are in light of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. If the old story doesn't make sense to you anymore, maybe Jesus wants you to reimagine the story. And it's to reconnect. It's to reconnect with the God you've always known, a God that you've sat with in the past, you've broke bread with in the past. It's to reconnect with that God in a new way. That's what happens to these Emmaus Road travelers. Jesus comes to meet them in their confusion, in their existential pain, as they're walking away, maybe walking away from everything. He allows them to offload their pain. He reinterprets their story and then reveals himself to them in an old way, which is also a new way. And that experience, that encounter with the risen Jesus is the thing that changes their life. They go from walking away to putting their coats back on and in the middle of the night going back to Jerusalem. You may have been in this place in the past. You may be here now. If you find yourself in a place where for whatever the reason you are feeling this kind of existential pain, you've experienced religious trauma, your belief system has fallen apart and you don't know how to replace it with something better, when it feels like God is absent, you're confused, you don't know what to believe anymore or if to believe at all. These are the moments when the risen Jesus wants to step into your life. Jesus does not want you walking away, but he is willing to come and walk alongside of you in your journey, to receive your pain, to reinterpret your story, and to show up, right, in a new way, so that you can have a new experience with him, so that instead of walking away, you can walk back in. You can become somebody who, like them, is no longer struggling with what to believe, but now has a purpose, has a very powerful story to tell. A story about an encounter with the risen Jesus who gave you a new lease on life. If you're in this place, I want you to know it's okay to doubt. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to wonder what to believe or wonder if you even should believe or want to believe. I know that can be a scary place, but it isn't necessarily a bad place. If while you're in that place, if you will allow Jesus to come and walk alongside of you, try offloading your pain to him. Try offloading your questions and your doubts to him. maybe hang in his story a little bit. See if his life and death and resurrection can't be understood in different ways, newer ways, better ways, ways that make more sense to you. Try to reconnect with experiences of God that you've had in the past that may lead to new experiences with Jesus in your present, to keep you from walking away and staying in with a different story to tell. That's my prayer and my hope for you, whether you're in that space now or you're in that space at some point in the future, that when you're in that low, dark moment, Jesus really does want to give you a new lease on life. Let me pray for you. God, we thank you that in our confusion, in our doubt, in our questioning, that you don't leave us. That even when we're struggling, not sure what to believe, that you remain true and you remain committed to us. I pray for all of the people who are watching this, if they are struggling with belief, if they're on the verge of walking away, I pray that you would come and you'd be with them. That you would give them a chance to offload their pain to you, to ask you their questions, that they would be able to reimagine the Christian story in a way that makes more sense to them, that they can live with in a real way. I pray you come and visit them in a powerful way, change their lives, give them a new story to tell, give them a new lease on life. We're grateful that you do this for people every day, all the time. We ask that you do it for us. We love and we trust you to do it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.